The day my son got married, I stood in the parking lot of the Fairmont Hotel in downtown Vancouver and read a text message that told me I wasn't welcome inside. Not from my son. He didn't have the nerve. It was from her. We discussed it and agreed it would be better if you didn't come in. There's a coffee shop on Robson. You can wait there. I read it 3 times. The late October wind came off Burrard Inlet and cut right through my jacket. The same navy blazer I'd pressed the night before because I wanted to look respectable for my son's wedding day. I stood there with my phone in my hand and the words on the screen, and somewhere above me, in a ballroom on the 14th floor, 300 guests were being seated for a ceremony I had paid for. I want to tell you what I did. But to understand it, you have to understand what came before. My son Nathan is 34 years old. I raised him alone after his mother, Carol, passed from ovarian cancer when he was 11. That's 23 years of just the 2 of us. Hockey practices at 5:30 in the morning in Burnaby. Science fair projects we stayed up until midnight finishing together at the kitchen table. I took on extra consulting contracts to get him through UBC without debt. When he graduated and got his first engineering job in North Vancouver, I drove the moving truck myself and helped him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken. That is the texture of a life built together. You don't replace that with a text message in a parking lot. I met Simone at a work conference in Calgary 18 months before the wedding. She was in corporate communications, sharp dresser, quick talker, the kind of woman who made you feel slightly off balance when she looked at you, like you'd already said something wrong and didn't know it yet. Nathan brought her home for Thanksgiving that first fall, and I cooked the full spread. Turkey, stuffing, butter tarts, the works. And she sat at my table and spent most of dinner on her phone. When I mentioned it gently to Nathan afterward, he looked at me like I'd insulted a stranger on the street. She's busy, Dad. She's got a demanding job. So does everyone, I said. He didn't call for 2 weeks after that. I adjusted. That's what you do. I watched what I said around her. I made efforts. I remembered to ask about her job, her family back in Mississauga, her opinions about things I didn't particularly care about. I sent her a birthday card in March and she never acknowledged it. Nathan told me she appreciated it. I took his word for it. When he called to tell me they were engaged, I was genuinely happy. I want to be clear about that. Whatever my reservations about Simone, I loved my son, and if she made him happy, that was enough for me. I told him that. I said, Nathan, I'm so glad for you, I mean it. He said, Dad, Simone and I were hoping. If you're up for it, maybe you could help with the wedding costs. I said, of course. I want to walk carefully through what happened next because this is the part that people later said I should have handled differently, and they're probably right. Over the following 6 weeks, Simone sent me a series of e-transfers with invoices attached. The venue deposit at the Fairmont, $14,000. The catering minimum for 300 guests, $22,000. Flowers, photography. The string quartet for the ceremony, $11,000 in total, a few smaller items here and there. By the time it was done, I had transferred just under $50,000 to an account Simone had set up for wedding coordination. Not to Nathan, to Simone. My financial advisor, a sensible man named Gordon who has known me for 15 years, looked at the transaction summary and said, You transferred this to your future daughter-in-law directly? Not a joint account? Not a venue deposit you made yourself? I said yes. He said, Lawrence. Just my name in that tone that means a man has run out of professional language. I told him she was going to be family. I told him Nathan trusted her. I told him I didn't want to make it a whole thing. Gordon nodded slowly and said we'd revisit it. What Gordon didn't know, what I hadn't told him, was that 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd started to see things that worried me. I came by Nathan's apartment one Saturday afternoon unannounced, the way I'd always done. He didn't answer the buzzer. I waited. A neighbor let me into the lobby and I knocked on his door. He answered looking like he hadn't slept. The apartment was a mess in a specific way. Not bachelor messy, which I knew well, but anxious messy. Dishes piled up, blinds down in the middle of the day. He said Simone had been handling the wedding budget and there were some stress about vendors. He said it vaguely, the way you talk about something you've been told not to talk about. I asked if everything was fine. He said yes, absolutely, everything was great. On my way to the parking garage, I passed the mailboxes and saw an envelope on the floor, slipped out of Nathan's slot. It was a notice from a collections agency. Not addressed to Nathan, addressed to Simone, at his address. I stood there and held it and thought about what Gordon had said. I went home and spent the weekend doing something I'm not proud of, but don't regret. I looked her up. Properly. I'm semi-retired, but I spent 30 years in financial consulting, and I still know how to find information. What I found took me the better part of 2 days to piece together, and when I was done, I sat at my kitchen table in my house in Port Moody with a mug of tea that went completely cold. And I thought about how I was going to tell my son that the woman he was marrying had filed for personal bankruptcy in Ontario 4 years earlier, had 2 civil judgments against her for unpaid debts, and had been let go from her previous position in Toronto under circumstances that were described in a very carefully worded LinkedIn post as a career transition. None of this made her a bad person. People have hard times, I know that. But $50,000 of my money was sitting somewhere I couldn't account for, and my son looked like he hadn't slept in a week, and the wedding was in 18 days. I called Nathan and asked if we could have dinner. He said, sure. I drove to his place and we went to a Greek restaurant in Lonsdale we'd been going to since he was a teenager, and over lamb chops. I told him everything I'd found. I laid it out carefully. I wasn't accusatory. I told him I loved him, that I wasn't attacking Simone, that I just needed him to know what I knew before we went any further. He listened to everything, the whole dinner. He didn't interrupt. Then he said, I know about the bankruptcy, Dad. She told me. She went through a really hard time in Toronto and she's rebuilt everything. You had no right to go digging into her past like that. I said, Nathan, I gave her $50,000. You gave it for our wedding. It's being used for our wedding. Then why did you look like you hadn't slept in a week when I came by on Saturday? He looked out the window for a moment. Then he looked back at me and he said, I think you should apologize to Simone. I drove home alone on the Trans-Canada and thought about what I was willing to do for my son. The answer, I had always believed, was anything. I was no longer certain that was true. I called Simone the next morning and said something that amounted to an apology for doing research I wasn't sorry for doing. She accepted it in a tone that let me know she had not accepted it at all. Over the following week and a half, I was slowly removed from the wedding. It happened gradually enough that I almost didn't notice. I was taken off the group chat. When I asked Nathan about rehearsal dinner logistics, he said Simone was handling it and would be in touch. She was not in touch. The day of the rehearsal, I waited for a call that didn't come. When I texted Nathan, he replied 4 hours later. So sorry, Dad. Simone thought she'd sent you the details. It was just close family anyway. I was his father. I was the only parent he had. But apparently I was not close family. The morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully and drove downtown and paid for parking at the Fairmont garage. I was proud of my son. I was proud of what we'd built together. Whatever had happened, he was getting married, and I was going to be there. And then my phone buzzed. We discussed it and agreed it would be better if you didn't come in. There's a coffee shop on Robson, you can wait there. I stood in that parking lot for a long time. The wind was cold. Somewhere above me, in that ballroom, a string quartet I had paid $11,000 for was warming up. Here's what I did not do. I did not go to the coffee shop on Robson. Here's what I did. I called Gordon. Gordon, to his credit, did not say I told you so. He said, Lawrence saw any of those transfers within the last 30 days. I said the last one was 22 days ago. He said, let me make some calls. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because people have opinions about it, and most of those opinions are based on misunderstanding Canadian banking. An Interactive transfer once deposited cannot be reversed. Gordon knew this. What Gordon also knew, because he'd been careful enough to suggest it at the time and I hadn't listened, was that one of the transfers, the one for the catering, had been flagged by my bank as potentially eligible for a dispute on the grounds that the service had not yet been rendered and there was documented evidence of possible misrepresentation. 22 days was still within the dispute window. Gordon filed the dispute at 11:47 that morning, while I sat in my car in the Fairmont parking garage. I want to tell you what it felt like to sit there. The radio was off. The concrete walls of the parkade were gray and smelled like exhaust. I had my blazer on and my good shoes and nowhere to go. I was 63 years old and my son was getting married without me 50 meters above my head, and I had spent 23 years doing everything I knew how to do, and it had led me to a parking garage on a Saturday morning in October. I did not cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. What I felt was something quieter and heavier than crying. A kind of settling, like a building finally finding its foundation after years of slight lean. I drove home to Port Moody. I changed out of my blazer. I made a pot of soup because it was cold and I didn't know what else to do. And making soup is something Carol taught me, and it always makes the house smell like someone is home. At 3:14 in the afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. At 3:41, Nathan called. I watched his name on the screen. I let it ring. He called again at 3:52 and at 4:07. Then Simone called twice from a number I didn't recognize. Then Nathan again, 3 times in a row, at 4:23. By 5 o'clock, I had 14 missed calls. I turned on the news and ate my soup. I should tell you what I learned later, because I didn't know any of it at the time, and I want to be honest about that. What I know now is that at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon during the reception, the catering manager approached Nathan and informed him that a payment dispute had been filed on the account, and that the catering company's legal team had advised them to pause service pending resolution. 300 guests, platters half served, the bar open, then suddenly not. Simone, from what Nathan told me weeks later, stood up in front of everyone and tried to explain. And the explaining made it worse, and the making it worse made people start leaving. And within 40 minutes most of the guests had gone, and what was left was a half-decorated ballroom and a wedding party standing around looking at their phones. I didn't feel satisfaction about this. I want to be honest about that too. Sitting in Port Moody eating soup and watching the news, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad in a way that had no clean edges to it. My phone kept ringing. By 9 o'clock that evening, I had 47 missed calls. I didn't sleep much. I sat up with the television on low volume, not really watching it, thinking about Nathan at age 11 sitting across from me in this same house, being told his mother was gone. Thinking about every hockey morning, every moving box, every late night over a science project. Thinking about the Thanksgiving turkey that went uneaten because Simone was on her phone. I thought, there is no version of this that doesn't hurt. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the table and called him back. He answered on the first ring. His voice was different. Not angry, not accusing. Just tired and young-sounding in a way he hadn't sounded in years. He said, "Dad." I said, "I'm here, Nathan." There was a long pause. Then he said, "She left last night. She took her stuff and she left." I didn't say anything. He said, "I found some things on her laptop. I don't really know who she is, Dad." I thought I did. I don't know if the wedding is even going to be legally registered. The marriage commissioner mentioned something about a filing issue and I can't even think about that right now. I said, "Do you need me to come over?" He said, "Yes." I drove to North Vancouver with a container of the soup and a bag of groceries, and when he opened the door, he looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours, which he had been. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table I'd helped him carry up 3 flights of stairs, and we ate soup and didn't say much for a long time. Eventually he said, "You tried to tell me." I said, "You were in love." He said, "I should have listened." I said, "Maybe. But you trusted someone." That's not a character flaw, Nathan. That's just being human. He looked at me across the table, his eyes red, and I thought about how much he looked like Carol. He has her jaw, her way of looking at you directly when something matters. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for the text, for all of it. She told me you'd been saying things about her behind her back and I believed her. I don't know why I believed her instead of you. I thought about the right thing to say. I've had a long time to think about the right things to say in hard moments, and I still mostly get it wrong. But that morning, I think I got it right. I said, 'It's already done. You're my son.' That's the only part I care about." The bank dispute was eventually resolved in my favor. It took 4 months and a lot of paperwork, and Gordon was excellent throughout. I recovered most of the catering transfer. Not all of it, but most. The rest is gone and I've made my peace with that. Tuition in a different form, Gordon said, and I thought that was about right. Simone moved back to Ontario. Nathan spoke to a lawyer in November and found out that, yes, there had been a procedural issue with the marriage commissioner's filing, and the marriage was not legally registered. Whether that was accident or design, I honestly don't know. Neither does he. Nathan took some time off work in December. He came out to Port Moody most weekends and we watched hockey and I cooked and we talked, sometimes about what happened, mostly about other things. In January he started seeing a counselor. I thought that was a good sign. People who are committed to understanding themselves generally do all right. I'm 64 now. I live alone in the house in Port Moody where Nathan grew up, which still smells like soup when I cook it, which is often. I have a good life, decent pension, friends I've known for 30 years. A Wednesday morning walk group that goes along the shoreline trail regardless of whether it's raining, which in Port Moody means we walk in the rain most of the time. The blazer is back in the closet. I'll wear it again. People sometimes ask me if I regret how I handled it. The dispute, the unanswered calls, all of it. And I've thought about that question honestly. What I regret is the year I spent making myself smaller to keep the peace. I regret not sitting Nathan down earlier and saying, "I see something that worries me, and I love you too much to say nothing." I regret the Thanksgiving turkey I cooked for someone who didn't look up from her phone. But the parking garage, the soup, letting the phone ring. No, I don't regret any of that. You spend your life teaching your children how to stand up for themselves. At some point, you have to remember that the lesson applies to you too. I've been sitting with this for a while now, long enough to see it clearly, without the anger getting in the way. What happened to me didn't come out of nowhere. It built slowly, the way most painful things do. One small concession at a time. I told myself I was being reasonable. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but there's a difference between being reasonable and making yourself invisible. And somewhere along the way, I had crossed that line without noticing. Every time I bit my tongue at Simone's dinner table silences, every time I rewrote a text to Nathan to make it softer than I meant it, every time I handed over money I had questions about, I was teaching both of them that my presence in that family had a price, and I was willing to keep paying it. That's not love. That's just fear dressed up as patience. Nathan isn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that. He's a good man who got tangled up with someone skilled at making good men doubt the people who knew them longest. That's not weakness on his part, it's just how that kind of manipulation works. It targets exactly the things you trust most about yourself: your loyalty, your open-mindedness, your willingness to believe the best in someone your son loves. I don't fault him for falling for it. I fault myself, a little, for not finding the right words sooner, for letting the discomfort of one hard conversation outweigh the cost of a year of silence. What I keep coming back to is Gordon. Not because of the dispute, though, yes, that mattered, but because Gordon looked at the facts in front of him and told me the truth anyway, even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. That's a rare thing. Most people will let you walk into a bad situation rather than risk the awkwardness of saying something. Gordon didn't. And I think about how differently things might have gone if I'd been as honest with Nathan as Gordon was with me. Honesty, real honesty, is an act of respect. It says, I think enough of you to tell you something difficult. When I softened everything to protect the relationship, I wasn't respecting Nathan. I was underestimating him. And then there's the parking garage. That hour sitting alone in the cold concrete quiet, with my blazer on and nowhere to go. People ask if I regret what I did there, and I understand why they ask. It looks like a drastic move. But here's what I know. I had done the right things. I had raised a son. I had paid for a wedding. I had apologized for research I wasn't wrong to do. At some point, a person has to decide what they're worth. Not in anger, not to prove a point. Just quietly, the way you'd set down something that's gotten too heavy to carry any further. That's the part Nathan understood eventually. He told me in January, over soup at my kitchen table, that what got through to him wasn't the bank dispute, wasn't the missed calls, wasn't any of it. It was that I didn't chase, he said. You just went home, Dad. And somehow that was the thing that finally made him see it clearly. I'm 64. I have a pension and a walk group and a house that smells like soup when the weather turns. I have my son back, not because I fought for him, but because I stopped abandoning myself to hold on to him. There's something in that worth remembering. The people who are meant to be in your life don't require you to disappear.